This is an abbreviated version of the presentation I'll be giving at the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association's annual conference in May 2019. And this is a presentation that's really in my wheelhouse. This is about 20th century social movements and cultural history, but it's also very much about cultural memory, how we examine the reality of the IWW as a union versus the mythology of one of America's most preeminent radical organizations. And it also has a lot to do with the history of our office, and in particular, one Attorney General, L.L. Thompson. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. L.L. Thompson was appointed Attorney General in 1919 and then was elected later that year. He was born in Sumner, Washington. He was the first Washington-born Attorney General. He was a Republican. He's a Navy veteran of World War I and a member of the American Legion. And his membership in the American Legion will be important later on. Thompson's foil in this story was the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical labor union founded in 1905. Members, known as Wobblies, advocated for a new society with economic democracy in which workers controlled their workplaces. The IWW had a long history of activity in Washington since the union was founded. It found success organizing in industries like timber, shipping, and mining. But their success led to severe repression. In 1909, hundreds of Wobblies were imprisoned and tortured in Spokane for soapboxing. In 1916, Wobblies were shot by police and vigilantes for supporting a strike in Everett. In 1917 and 1918, Wobblies were beaten and thrown out of Centralia for attempting to unionize loggers. And in 1919, Wobblies were jailed and beaten in Seattle during the Seattle General Strike. This is a 1922 photograph of IWW prisoners who were sent to federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. 150 IWW members from around the country were charged with obstructing the war effort. The 1917 Sedition Act and the 1918 Immigration Act gave sweeping powers to the government to imprison and deport dissidents. So before Thompson was even in office, going after radicals was a pretty normal activity. The first Red Scare reached its high point in 1919, the same year Thompson was made Attorney General, and 2 years after the Russian Revolution. It was the product of fear of communists, anarchists, immigrants, and labor radicals, pretty much the IWW's core constituency. Thompson's reaction to the IWW helps us understand the first Red Scare by showing how local and state politicians carried out what was then a nationwide cultural phenomenon. February 1919 was the Seattle General Strike, a 5-day work stoppage that paralyzed the city. The IWW had helped plan the strike. Business leaders, politicians, and others believed that the Bolshevik Revolution had spread to the western United States. Mayor Ole Hansen deputized a militia to patrol the city with machine guns to intimidate IWW members and other strikers. The strike was the largest labor action in the U.S. for almost a century. Many people in the state were already suspicious of the IWW. For example, see this excerpt from the Seattle Times, quote, "The industrial workers of the world constitute a lawless class growing out of European conditions and imported from Europe," unquote. Here's another excerpt from a different Times story, quote, "Anarchists are 99% aliens and criminals from foreign prisons," unquote. So you can see that the IWW was portrayed as being anti-American, pro-immigrant, pro-crime, pro-anarchism. In November 1919, that same year, on the first celebration of Armistice Day, the Centralia Massacre occurred in the small logging town of Centralia. A veterans group called the American Legion organized a parade with regional chapters to march through the town. The IWW was once again in Centralia trying to organize the timber industry. Accounts differ about what happened, but at the end of the day, 4 American Legion members were killed. According to both groups, the shooting began when the American Legion halted in front of the IWW's Union Hall. According to the Legion, the IWW had stationed shooters on rooftops along the parade route who fired down on the parade. According to the IWW, the shooting didn't begin until after the American Legion formed ranks and stormed the building. When the shooting stopped, a dozen Wobblies were arrested, along with their lawyer, Elmer Smith. These are the IWW members who were convicted for the attack. They were sentenced to between 25 and 40 years for second-degree murder. The Washington Supreme Court upheld their convictions. Another Wobbly, Wesley Everest, was never tried because he was lynched the night after the shooting. Their local lawyer, Elmer Smith, was acquitted, rearrested, and had his second case dismissed. Everest was dragged out of the jail during the night, and evidence suggests the Legion helped kidnap him. After Everest was lynched, the other Wobblies were put on trial for murder. The trial seemed to be biased from the start. No Legionnaires were charged, only Wobblies. After the convictions, 6 jurors admitted they had been intimidated by local timber company thugs. The Centralia affair launched Thompson's personal involvement in the Wobbly cases. The AGO was still, at this time, a tiny executive agency. Only 12 people were employed in the office, including Thompson and his 5 assistant attorneys general. Thompson insisted that the office actively pursue convictions, deportations, and imprisonment for IWW members. Of the 6 attorneys in the office, at least 3 aided the prosecutions in several IWW cases. Thompson attacked the IWW on a number of grounds. The Immigration Act and the Sedition Act targeted those who opposed the war, like many members of the IWW, socialist IWW co-founder Eugene Debs, anarchists, and most importantly, immigrants. Thompson lamented, quote, "They publish such pamphlets in 14 or 15 different languages. They have so large a proportion of aliens in their ranks," unquote. And you can really see the xenophobia in the language that he uses. In 1919, the state legislature passed a law against criminal syndicalism. Quote, "The doctrine which advocates crime, sabotage, violence, or other unlawful methods of terrorism, the advocacy of such doctrine is a felony," unquote. This law made membership in the IWW a felony because the IWW advocated for a creation of a new society through radical industrial change and occasional sabotage, and this remained state law until 1936. A subsequent bill later that session further clarified what engaging in criminal syndicalism meant. Not only was being a member of the IWW a felony, but so was any activity which helped the IWW. In 1921, in a case called State v. Hennessy, the state Supreme Court affirmed a conviction of an IWW member. Thompson filed an amicus brief that argued that the legislature had the right to adopt, quote, "needful police regulations," unquote. But Thompson took many other steps to combat the IWW. The first was his appeals to the Department of Labor, but Thompson's biggest trouble ended up being with the Department of Labor. Thompson demanded that the DOL deport all foreign Wobblies in Washington, but the DOL responded it wouldn't unless there was proof that individuals had distributed literature or broken other laws. So Thompson complained at length to Washington's congressmen and senators, trying to get them to take action against the Department of Labor. Thompson's letter to the Department of Labor demanded action be taken because the IWW was, quote, "the only organization of this character of any importance in the state," unquote. He then had his letter published in the Seattle Sunday Times. Thompson wrote to one of Washington's congressmen, quote, "It is my hope that if we can cause sufficient agitation, we can force a cleanup in the Department of Labor," unquote. Thompson helped local prosecutors convict IWW members by giving advice and material aid. AAG Glenn Fairbrook wrote, quote, "Mr. Thompson himself is taking an active interest in these cases, and other members of this office have assisted in the preparation of material for the legal questions which will arise," unquote. He said AGO staff were out of the office so often that only Fairbrook was left to answer urgent correspondence. Prosecutors met with Thompson personally. Several local prosecutors sent correspondence to Thompson thanking him for the aid he provided. Thompson wrote to one, quote, "Allow me to congratulate you upon the result of these cases," unquote, showing Thompson's ongoing interest in the cases. Thompson also urged county prosecutors to rush the IWW cases through the courts to prevent Wobblies from finding enough lawyers to defend them. Thompson personally interviewed local prosecutors to see if they were capable of securing convictions. On multiple occasions, Thompson was dissatisfied with their abilities, so he contacted county judges to recommend outside counsel take over the prosecutions. In one case, he insisted on a Legionnaire named E.K. Brown handling the job. He tried to insert the American Legion directly into the prosecutions of IWW members. Thompson also advised other states and the Congress on how to attack the IWW. Thompson wrote to a U.S. senator, quote, "It is very imperative that legislation be enacted to curb the activities of alien Reds in this country. In this section, we have particularly to do with the IWW." Unquote. Even after World War I ended, Thompson was demanding a sedition act that would impose more severe penalties on radicals. Thompson also wrote to other states on how to undermine IWW organizing. For example, when asked about Washington's criminal syndicalism law, Thompson advised a congressman from Kansas on penalties for IWW membership. He said that jurors were hesitant to find Wobblies guilty of felonies, so he advised the lawmaker to go for gross misdemeanor instead, because, quote, "convictions, I think, would be easier to obtain," unquote. Thompson also contacted the attorneys general of nearby states, including Montana, Idaho, Arizona, and California. Many western states had strong IWW presences, so these AGs all shared a common enemy. Thompson provided legal advice and copies of the AGO's amicus from State v. Hennessy to help other states secure convictions against Wobblies. Thompson also actively engaged the American Legion to help fight against the IWW. He wrote the American Legion's headquarters, quote, "Both as Attorney General of this state and also as a member of the American Legion post of this city, I attended the conference to submit suggestions to the national headquarters as to what the Legion can do in combating the activities of the IWW." Unquote. Thompson used the power of his office to insert himself into the national fight against radicalism and anarchism in the United States. Thompson relied heavily on county prosecutors to carry out his agenda of dismantling the IWW. Thompson influenced as many cases as he could, including working with prosecutors and assigning 2 of his AAGs to provide assistance. He also attempted to influence national policy on the subject. You can see how the Red Scare played out on the local level. Thompson readily used the terminology of the day to demonize and scrutinize the IWW. As the state's chief legal officer, he helped convict members of the most visible radical organization in the state. Dozens of Wobblies went to prison, and his arguments were cited in the court decision that affirmed the state's criminal syndicalism laws. Here's the rest of the story for General Thompson. He resigned as Attorney General in 1923. AAG John Dunbar served the rest of his term, and then was elected for 2 terms of his own. Thompson started a lucrative private practice in Tacoma, and he was an active member of the Pierce County Bar and the Washington State Judicial Council. As to the Centralia Wobblies who were convicted of second-degree murder, Elmer Smith, their lawyer and former co-defendant, led a public advocacy campaign to free them until his death in 1932. 6 Wobblies had their sentences commuted in 1933 by Governor Clarence D. Martin, but Ray Becker, who is circled here in red, held out and refused parole. He was later pardoned in 1939. And here's one more interesting epilogue. IWW organizing is still going on throughout Washington State, as well as North America, Europe, and Australia. The Seattle IWW branch is the largest branch in the United States and is organizing in several industries in the city. There are other branches in Olympia, Tacoma, Everett, Bellingham, and Vancouver Island. And when I called and asked them how many members they had, they declined to tell me. They seem to think it's a little bit strange that a researcher from the Attorney General's office would call and ask them about how many members they have. And that is the story of how L.L. Thompson went after the IWW while he was Attorney General of Washington State.